The member for Hughes.
Thank you, Speaker. It's very pleased this morning to rise to speak on the Electoral and other legislation amendment bill. And before I start, Speaker, I would hope that as soon as possible I invite the members of the opposition to call a quorum so many of my colleagues can join me and hear my speech and hear the points I have to make out. But firstly, Speaker, the reason for this bill is that it is a fundamental tenet of our democracy that we have free and fair elections. We cannot have elections in this country where there's coercion, where there's intimidation, where there's threats, and also where there is downright deceptions, where one side of politics takes it upon themselves to impersonate a Commonwealth agency, to deceive, hoodwink and con the Australian electorate. Now, the Australian public know that truth is not a leftist value. We can all remember the former Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, with that speech previously, "There will be no carbon tax under a government I lead." So in the public debate, when a member from the Labor Party stands up, the Australian public know that they speak with a forked tongue. But what the Australian public trusts is government agencies. So what we saw at the last election, I think, was one of the most disgraceful campaigns in the electoral history of this nation. What became known as the Medicare scare campaign. And I well remember in the early part of the election, standing on a railway station down at Jannali, handing out some flyers and talking to constituents that were going to work early in the morning, catching the train from Jannali into the city. And when there was a queue of people, someone walked past and someone yelled out, "They're going to sell Medicare." And I thought to myself, no, what a stupid comment, what a stupid phrase. You cannot sell Medicare. It is not something that can be sold. What are you actually going to sell? Medicare pays out money. There's nothing there, even if you wanted to sell it, it's not worth anything. That is just simply an illogical comment, a comment that simply doesn't make sense. And I thought no one would actually believe that. And if a Labor person stood up and just said that by themselves, they would actually be laughed at. They'd be laughed at and people would dismiss them, knowing the Labor members' history at election campaigns. But what gave that deception and that, and I hate to say the word in this house, that lie, what gave that lie credibility was that text message that they sent out. Text message that was unauthorised, that created the false impression in the minds of millions of Australians that was actually came from Medicare itself. There was no political disclosure that this was a message from the Labor Party, so when people would see, oh, this is a message from the Labor Party, and they would know on the track record of the Labor Party that it would be based on falsehoods and dishonesty. But by not having that disclosure in there, people were tricked, they were conned, and they were hoodwinked. Now, you would think, having engaged in such disgraceful conduct against the very principles of our democracy, to try and undermine, to be involved in a deceptive scheme that undermined free and fair elections in this country, you would think that members of the Labor Party would be a little bit contrite. You would think they would come in here and they would apologise and they say, yes, look, that was a step too far, we didn't mean it, we are sorry. That is what you would expect. But instead, members of the Labor Party come in here and they wear that deception as a badge of honour. They actually think that they are clever, that they deceived and they misled the Australian public, that they impersonated a Commonwealth agency They are actually proud of that. This tells us everything we need to know about today's modern Labor Party. You would hope during this debate at least one member of the Labor Party would stand up. We'll come to get up in a minute. Would stand up and would say, "We are sorry. We are sorry. That campaign misled the Australian people." But no. It's a badge of honour, and they actually laugh about deceiving the Australian public. They actually boast about undermining a fundamental tenet of our democracy. That's why this legislation is necessary.
The member for Fremantle.
Deputy Speaker, understanding Order 55, I wish to draw your attention to the state of the House.
Quorum required. There's no quorum. Ring the bells.
We have examples.
Quorum is present. Member for Hughes.
Fremantle for calling my colleagues here to the House so I could remind them that truth is not a leftist value. I could remind them that the Labor Party have a long history of deception and misleading the Australian public, and how they engaged in that fraudulent Medicare scare campaign at last election, how they were trying to undermine our democracy, the right of free and fair elections, and that they are actually proud of it. That is the greatest disgrace. That is the disgrace, that they're actually proud and they boast and they wear it as a badge of honour. Well, we will remind the Australian public at the next election about the tricks that the Labor Party are getting up to. You think you may have gained some short-term political advantage by deceiving the Australian public. But the next election, we will remind them how they were deceived at the last election by a dishonest and fraudulent campaign underwritten by the Australian Labor Party. That's why this legislation is needed. Because what will happen at the next election? What is to stop the Labor Party from masquerading as Centrelink and sending out messages to Centrelink recipients, pretending that there would be cuts to their Centrelink pay. What is to stop them from doing the Department of Immigration, sending out false and fraudulent and misleading and deceptive and untruthful emails and text messages that people would be migrated? What about the Department of Veterans Affairs? Nothing would stop the Labor Party. Nothing would stop the Labor Party. That is why this legislation is needed. Now, it is one thing, Deputy Speaker, at the next election, as another example, there will be a debate on many issues. There will be a debate on energy policy. The Labor Party will argue, and as they are entitled to in a democracy, argue for a 50% renewable energy target. They will say to us, look at the wonders of South Australia. Look at how brilliant the South Australian economy is. Look how wonderful. They actually have the highest electricity prices in the world. Isn't this something we should achieve? Because this way we will save the world. On this side of the House, we'll remind the Australian public that high electricity prices actually damage, destroy the economy, destroy jobs, cause hardship and suffering to those that can least afford it. The Labor Party will explain that they think we just build all these wind turbines and we'll have all this power. Isn't this wonderful? Don't they look fantastic? We'll explain to the Australian people that when the wind doesn't blow, the power does not flow. And Deputy Speaker, there is nothing wrong with that. That is how debates in a democracy should go about. It should be a contest of ideas, as where we get up and we argue our cause, and Labor get up and argue their cause, of course with their friends the Greens, and get up. That's how democracy should work. And people listen to both sides of the argument and they make their decision at the ballot box. That is the concept of fair and free elections. But where that gets undermined is where one side decides that they will masquerade as a Commonwealth entity, when they will send out bulk text messages in their hundreds of thousands, if not millions, masquerading as Medicare, or masquerading as the Australian Energy Market Operator, or masquerading as the Department of Veterans Affairs, or masquerading as Centrelink. We know that there is no deception that the Labor Party will not go to. That's why this legislation is of such importance. Because I believe that our democracy is important. I believe that free and fair elections are something that 100,000 Australians have died for, have sacrificed their lives for. And if we lose the debate in a fair and free elections, and if we cannot argue our cause, Deputy Speaker, that is democracy. But what is not democracy is impersonating Commonwealth agencies. That's why we must have legislation in this country. We must have legislation, Deputy Speaker, that requires authorisations on bulk text messages. That is a technology that was not there when the Australian Electoral Act was first written. It is an absolutely essential, fundamental thing that we must do to protect the democracy in this country. And I would hope that the Labor Party, the Greens and their mates at Get Up support this legislation. I would hope that they would also go further and they would make it a criminal offence to impersonate a Commonwealth body. Because our democracy is so important, Deputy Speaker. We must have fair and free elections in this country. And that is what this legislation protects, and I commend it to the House.